If you could travel back in time to cities like London, Paris, and Berlin, you would have seen wounded men everywhere in 1919, 1920, 1921, and so on. Amputees and blind men were seemingly everywhere, especially in public places like subways, parks, and squares, hat in hand, begging for money, selling cheap goods like matches, and many looking like the lost souls they were. Men from the upper classes may have had the financial security to prevent having to live on the street, but pity and self-pity, a feeling of uselessness, and much, much more haunted many men every day. 2 million British or Imperial soldiers were wounded. Approximately 4 million French and Germans, respectively, were wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, and that's just the Western Front. World War I wasn't the first world war in human history, but it was the first modern industrialized war, and men were killed and wounded on an industrial scale. Today, we examine why soldiers feared the brutal trenches of World War I. Battle of the Somme. One of the war's most famous battles was the Battle of the Somme, which occurred from July 1st to November 18, 1916. The battle was one of the longest and bloodiest of the war, and is often used as an example to show how little the generals understood the type of war they were fighting, and how deadly the new modernized weapons of World War I were. The week before the British attacked on July 1st, they fired 1.5 million shells at the German lines, which were concentrated in an area of about 15 miles long. That's over 200,000 shells a day fired in an area the size of Manhattan Island. Unfortunately, when the British attacked, most Germans came out of their well-made bunkers and killed them by the thousands daily. On the first day, the British lost over 19,000 men killed and nearly 60,000 wounded. Yes, you heard right. It was hell on earth for both sides. The sound of guns, explosions, being underground with many other soldiers, fear of death, rats, darkness, dirt, blood, infection, human waste, smells, and, not least of all, madness, either temporary or permanent, coming from being pounded with high explosive shells non-stop for 7 days. Ultimately, the British and their French allies took about 6 miles deep and 20 miles long before they were halted. The dead from both sides is estimated to have been between 250 and 300,000. The amount of men wounded was many times that. And that's how most of World War I was fought, especially on the Western Front. Artillery. World War I is known for a lot of things. The first air combat, submarines, poison gas, trench warfare, and more. One of the things the men that were there said was that artillery fire was almost incessant. You got used to it, even while it was being fired directly at you. Well, some got used to it, others said they did and really did not. Whether you were a veteran who wasn't too rattled by the shelling or a green recruit on his first day on the front, odds were that if you were going to die in World War I, it was from artillery fire. The British and French made over 1 billion artillery shells during the war, and got many more from the United States. Germany alone produced nearly 700 million shells. And those are just the nations who fought on the very short but most densely manned and fortified Western Front. From the 3.2-inch, 81mm mortar shells fired by infantrymen near or in the front-line trench positions, to the 9-inch, 234mm howitzer, and the many in between. Armies in World War I were capable of hitting targets far and near. There were so many guns in some places and during some battles, like the Somme, Verdun, and Cambrai, that fields hundreds of yards in size would be covered in guns, and they could sometimes target very small areas, thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of shells hitting areas the size of a small American town. Nothing could live above ground very long when this happened, and many men underground died as well. If they were lucky, they died without even knowing it, blown into pieces in a millisecond. Others were buried alive, had limbs torn off, organs ruptured, and turned into jelly from the concussion of a nearby exploding shell, or shredded by the thousands of pieces of shrapnel flying through the air and at thousands of feet per second. Every limb was at risk, and if you lost a hand, arm, foot, or leg, the prosthetic device, if one was available to you, was likely painful and uncomfortable to wear, and not very user-friendly. Most arms ended in a hook that was not easy to use and was operated by rotating the shoulder or body. Men either wore the famous peg leg or simply used a crutch and developed a powerful upper body by holding their leg weight up when walking. Many times, limbs weren't the only things missing, and in the more repressed early 20th century, men who lost their private parts were not only physically wounded, but emotionally, socially, and psychologically. Of course, there's the famous shell shock of World War I. Today we call it PTSD, and it didn't necessarily come from being shelled, though World War I was notorious for men losing their minds, control of their bodies, or both from being exposed to not only the noise and concussion of seemingly endless shelling, but when the constant fear of death or maiming and the sights they saw during and after countless enemy shells had stopped falling for a time. Men living in bunkers and trenches for days and weeks at a time kind of reached their emotional ropes simply by being in a tight, crowded space underground. Then add to the monumental shelling of World War I, and men's brains could literally turn to mush from concussion. Those who weren't killed could suffer traumatic brain injury from concussion, shrapnel, or the impact of being blown through the air. The incessant fear could cause the brain to shut down and pretend it's elsewhere, or begin to send nervous signals through the body that could cause men to convulse, twitch, drool, scream, kick, and more uncontrollably. Sometimes shell shock would last only a short time, perhaps minutes or hours. Sometimes it would last weeks, months. Some men never recovered. Poison gas. Many historians believe that Hitler did not order the use of poison gas on the World War II battlefield because he had been the victim of a gas attack on the Western Front in World War I. Of course, we know that he condoned the use of poison gas on those he perceived as his internal enemies, the Jews of Europe and others, but he forbade its use on the battlefield, even against the Soviets. According to his bizarre autobiography Mein Kampf, Hitler was lying in a German hospital, blind from a gas attack. When the news of the German defeat broke, he reportedly regained his vision and realized he was the man to lead Germany. So goes the Nazi mythology. But Hitler was indeed a victim of a gas attack in World War I and did regain his sight, like many, but not all did. Various kinds of gases were used on the battlefields in World War I, especially on the Western Front. 4 main types of gas were used during the war in different varieties and recipes from country to country and year to year. These were mustard, chlorine, phosgene, and arsenic-based mixtures like lewisite. The French were the first to use gas as a weapon during the war. In the first month of World War I, August 1914, they released a type of tear gas to immobilize or stall German soldiers. Tear gas can cause intense irritation of the tear ducts, causing blurred vision, intense nasal discharge, and difficulty breathing. Large amounts can cause temporary blindness, but it's rarely lethal unless inhaled in extreme and concentrated doses. All the main combatants experimented with tear gas and other irritants. Still, it didn't do what they wanted it to do, which was killing or completely immobilizing enemy troops for an extended period. The first real gas attack was a German chlorine gas assault, which came in April 1915 at the famous Battle of Ypres in Belgium. Have you ever been in a swimming pool that's been overchlorinated? You know that it can be difficult to breathe when your face is near the water. Your breath catches and you want to cough. Of course, your eyes sting as they usually do in chlorinated pools, but much worse. Now, imagine a gas that's similar, only concentrated. Chlorine gas smelled like pineapple and pepper, which sometimes gave warning to enemy troops. And it was light green in color. What happens to the body when it's inhaled? Well, concentrated chlorine gas, when inhaled, reacts with the fluid in the lungs and forms hydrochloric acid, which destroys lung tissue and can lead to an excruciating death by suffocation. Exposure to lesser amounts can cause vomiting, intense eye irritation, and coughing fits that last hours. In the first attack at Ypres, the gas killed 1,100 men. They had no defense, no gas masks, no early warning system of any kind. Unfortunately for the Germans, the attack was too effective, and they waited too long before they sent men forward, losing an opportunity to advance in a large and empty section of the French front lines. Soon, both sides were deploying gas regularly, forming dedicated chemical warfare troops and racing to find more and more lethal types of gas. Mustard gas was the weapon that was the most common and easiest gas to produce. Though it burned the eyes, nose, and exposed skin, and could cause severe pulmonary edema, the buildup of fluid in the lungs causing men to drown. It also had a strong, garlicky mustard smell. It could often be detected early, preventing many deaths. Only 1% of all World War I fatalities were caused by gas, even though both sides worked hard to come up with just the right formula to kill many men at a time, preferably without them knowing it was about to happen. Relatively odorless and colorless gases like phosgene and lewisite were made later in the war. Phosgene was the most deadly gas produced during the war. It rapidly caused fluid buildup in the lungs, drowning men on dry land. Lewisite was similar to mustard gas, and the second type of lewisite, made with a high concentration of arsenic, was more lethal. Like mustard gas, it causes painful blistering and leaking burns outside and inside the body. The men who recovered from gas attacks often spent the rest of their lives feeling its effects: reduced vision or complete blindness, breathing problems, and scarification from burns. The emotional and mental trauma of being caught in a gas attack was extreme. After gas was first used, a race began to create effective gas masks. At first, they were hardly effective, though by the time the war ended, most gas masks were able, at the very least, to mitigate some of the gas's effects. Imagine, though, sitting in a bunker confined to a gas mask, which was very hard to breathe through. Hundreds of shells might be raining down on top of you. Some of those wounded and killed by gas were men who lost it in the claustrophobia and difficult breathing of the mask, ripped them off, and received a face and lungful of chemicals. In the end, gas was largely ineffective, especially considering the expense, use of manpower, and results. But its psychological effects were significant. Aside from the claustrophobia and the physical effect, men on the battlefield experienced what it's like to be killed off like a rat, roach, or other vermin in the world's first industrialized war. This is History on Fleek. See you next time.